Okay.
And in presence there's a audience member, Ray Craig.
I'd like to read this quickly.
Okay, we're not in a rush.
Yeah. I have my own opinions, but I want to see what TK had to say too.
You want to go through roll call and then we'll just pause
Yeah,
and read?
go ahead, and maybe we can ask Dee to think about what. Go ahead and do a roll call. And I'll ask you to think
Okay.
about something.
Ted Carlson,
Yeah.
Terry Kelly, David Nesbitt,
Here.
Keith Silver,
Here.
Steve Strong. Also present by telephone is Dee Ennis, Deputy Municipal Attorney. We have a quorum.
Dee, while Dave is reading this letter from that Terry submitted,
Okay.
you may know in the ordinance, and Ted's been searching frantically for something that allows for something within the ethics code in the case of an emergency. You want to explain what you mean, Ted?
Yeah, remember it came up in discussion downstairs when we met with the assembly last time, where they can, there's a section in there where they can overrule this in case of an emergency, or if it means that it would be better serve the community, this sort of thing. Do you remember
Right.
where that was at?
Yeah, well, I remember you talking about it and bringing it up.
Right.
I wondered if that could be another factor, whether you'd have that in the ethics code or in the general sort of emergency powers in the code.
No, it's in the ethics code somewhere where they can, because I read it to them when we were down there,
Okay.
and, but I didn't mark it in my book.
Now, there is a section that does say that they can, they take that what we're doing is by advisement only, and they don't have to take what we say as, they don't have to do what we say.
Right.
But D, if they do ignore what we have to say
Uh-huh.
in the last ruling, does an assembly member who introduces an ordinance have some sort of immunity from a notice of potential violation afterwards?
I think the hope is that the ethics board and that the subcommittee, the assembly subcommittee, adopts this particular version, which they think will help take care of that problem.
I
Okay.
understand, but in the way things currently stand,
Uh-huh.
if the assembly chooses as a body to ignore our last ruling, would
Can I guess I don't understand why you think that they're choosing to ignore your ruling. And I wondered if I could give you about a 5-minute background on the state statute, which is where this particular ordinance ended up. The new proposed ordinance.
that was the West Alaska statute annotated, just hit the desk. Are you ready for that, or you want to read some more?
Well, I'm kind of still in the middle of this, but let's just go. Dee's on the line, so let's go with what Dee had to say.
Well, there was just 2 minutes of history on this. We're a home rule municipality. And so when this all came up, then I quickly went and checked and wanted to see whether we had any limitations on what we could do in this area. And for instance, defining sponsorship, or defining that that's not official action. Do we have restrictions on that ability? And sure enough, under our state statute, where it goes over home rule municipalities, one of the sections that it delineates is conflict of interest. And in that conflict of interest, it simply says any general home rule municipality has to adopt their own conflict of interest standards, which need to provide at least this. And so the language that's been adopted into this ordinance, proposed ordinance, is exactly from the state statute.
Can I ask you a quick question about that?
Sure.
Because I pulled the statute and I was going through it, and in the notice of decisions it talks about how this is a baseline and that the municipalities can enact something that may be stricter, but this is something that cannot go below. It's kind of a standard provision. The question I have is, the municipal code seems to have made it a little stricter to the extent that it does not have that clause other than the governing body in it. Is that right?
It appears more restrictive at
Right.
this point, yeah, the current version.
And so the question I had is, I can only assume, and this is something that we deal with all the time when we're going over legislative intent, is that was deliberate, that when fashioning the municipal code, the drafters of the municipal code specifically excluded that clause, other than the governing body. So I'm wondering if you have any background on that issue.
And no, we don't, because there was 2 or 3 people trying to put that together at the last minute, and sometimes they took state language and other times they didn't.
I'm sorry,
And-
who was putting it together at the last minute?
Well, it was Julia, Ken Stout, and even apparently Chris Birch was involved in it as well.
Chris Birch was actually on the assembly at the time.
Yeah. And so, my dad, there is no, if you look at sort of legislative history for ordinances, you look at the AMs, and there's just nothing in there. I mean, they would just laboriously try to pull together ethics code from very many sources. So, I have to tell you, my very strong instinct is there was no further thought to it being more restrictive.
Okay.
So, and generally, I mean, when we start getting into different conflicts, I think people are more comfortable relying on than looking at the state to see what they're doing. So that's just the general little history, one way or the other. I mean, it's just that's how that language got pulled, because lo and behold, there was language in the state on this issue, and so it got pulled.
I'm sorry, I don't understand that. So it was in the state statute, but it got pulled from the city's code?
Oh, no, I mean pulled from that into this ordinance.
Oh, I see. But,
The attempt was simply, hey, the state's dealt with it.
Right.
Although I didn't see much state law on it either.
no.
Yeah.
But there's but I'm wondering, just because that's such a specific clause, other than a member of the governing body, that was eliminated from the code. Yet that wasn't, I mean, if they were going to pull it from the state statute, then there's no reason why they would have eliminated that clause. Unless there really was no reason and they just were copying it, but that doesn't make sense either. I understand what you're saying, Dee. I just thought maybe there was some background.
Yeah, we're just not finding anything more than that.
Is this door unlocked? Mind if I close it?
No, go ahead.
Just pull.
And there are a lot of people wandering the hallways.
Yeah.
I saw something in which one.
Right, and they're all downstairs too, I think. So, all right, I interrupted you, Dee. Keep going.
Oh, and no, that was really it. That's just simply looking for a state statute that happens to be on point in this particular issue, pulling that language, getting away from defining sponsorship as not being an official action. The state definitions of official action are very broad. Any action or inaction, so that wasn't and I think the ethics board has all along wanted the, thought that as much as you could get this kind of stuff over to the assembly, you wanted to do that.
Right.
And so this allows that to happen. Now, whether people, I haven't seen Terry see, whether people agree with it being the less restrictive, more restrictive, this was the way to be consistent with state statute to allow it to happen. And that's all I have.
Okay.
And then, of course, adding in that new factor, weighing the public and the private interest. And I guess, one of the things happened at the last meeting is I tried to explain that there really are other instances of this, like redistricting and participating in election review of your own election, that this does come up in other contexts.
Now, the code has not prevented that from happening, though, right? I mean, the assembly acts on those things consistently. and has been acting consistently without a code change. Is that right?
Right, yeah, yeah.
So they just do it.
Yeah, they just do it, exactly.
Right. Okay. So
And-
there's never been a conflict before.
Well, I mean, one of our own members raised the conflict of why one of the assembly members was involved in reviewing the mayoral election and couldn't understand that. And I can tell you it happens all the time in the redistricting issues.
Sure.
There's sort of, I think that the assembly feels that it's their duty to do these things, and they are doing what this ordinance does directly. They're doing it indirectly. So it's not that there wasn't a conflict, it's that the assembly's not addressing it as a conflict.
Right.
But, Heidi, this is Linda.
Hi.
It seems to me that distinction with redistricting and things like it, those are externally generated rather than internally generated. And I think that's kind of the crux of the struggle.
Well, if you're saying that internal because it extends terms, it's still a conflict,
Well,
a potential conflict.
internally generated because it extends terms, and they are starting this fire of their own volition, whereas redistricting is external because a court told you you had to, or something else triggers it.
They have a duty.
Yeah, and so I think
got
that
it.
there's still that essential distinction between the two.
And NC and I don't agree with that. I think we need an ordinance that addresses these type of conflicts. And why some are ignored and some are not, I don't think that's good policy.
So essentially, what you're saying is that the assembly has just been ignoring this to a certain extent to accomplish certain goals because they feel it's their duty. Whereas this particular issue has brought it to a head that they can't, that is a conflict, and then this would then have a trickle-down effect on all the other things that they've been doing. Is that right?
Well, potentially it'd be more consistent. I mean, this one, of course, was brought to the ethics board as a wide open ethical problem, and the ethics board, gave an opinion. So nothing wrong with that at all either. But these other more ones that are sort of closed in duties and processes have their own conflicts as well.
Part of my concern about this is that, and maybe you can help address this, Dee, because when you take it to its logical conclusion, it seems to me that it opens the door for the assembly to start voting on things on its own behalf. That this doesn't really have that suddenly they can extend their own terms. I mean, that in and of itself is such a gut reaction versus something where they vote on taxes or on redistricting.
I don't think that this opens the door to them voting on their own terms. It opens the door to getting it in front of the assembly in a public debate, in a public forum. I'm not sure the result will be different in the long run. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, there's still a weighing test, and the other members of the board, of the assembly, have to address that. And you may have 5 assembly members that feel exactly like the ethics board felt at the last meeting. This goes too far.
When you
Or
say
it can be addressed in a less conflict way.
when you say this, what do you mean this?
Extending terms.
Right.
But just because if this ordinance were to go further, I don't think that necessarily opens up the doors to extending terms.
Uh-huh.
I think there still has to be an overview of that, and it would be debated in the public. Yeah, I think you have very strong opinions on this issue at the assembly level. And again, isn't it their job to do that? I mean, if anything, most of the assembly members are very overly cautious about conflicts.
So, Dee, this is Keith. I understand
Uh-huh.
some stuff. I understand what you've said, and I'm not we obviously are all puzzled over this. Under D6 on page 3,
Uh-huh.
I personally have a comment, whether in the totality of public benefit exceeds the financial or private interest, to me appears to be an awful subjective comment as opposed to an objective thing. And I'm wondering if that is something that should be in the ordinance.
Keith, I have to say, it is more subjective, but isn't always the ruling of other assembly members about individual assembly members' conflicts somewhat subjective? I'm not sure there's a way to get an objective test there. And again, and I don't think, I'm hoping that this isn't opening the floodgates. I don't see it as that. I see the assembly members still taking their role seriously in terms of conflicts.
I guess part of the issue too, Dee, is that it seems to me that this is very easily avoided by simply having a proposed effective date as a later date. What I mean is that this seems to me that this appears to be kind of opening the door to all kinds of other things to simply accommodate one specific instance versus what can be if you simply, and this is what we discussed in our advisory opinion too, and this is why I disagree with certain portions of this proposed introductory statement, is that we didn't say it's not possible. We weren't saying that this isn't possible. We were simply saying it was done before this way with an effective date of a later date where it doesn't affect sitting members pre-election. So I guess what that to me seems like the more streamlined approach to this. Why go through a code change to accommodate this when it simply can be avoided by having an effective date at a different date?
Well, because I think one of the things this whole issue brought up is how do you get this to the Assembly for debate? How do you get this even up to for public hearing and debate? And as our ethics code is currently written, you can't get to the public portion of this, and it's the public portion that's so important. To me, this ordinance would allow it to go to the public. It would allow the other assembly members to rule on it. And again, I don't see that as any easy thing in this particular matter. So it gets it into a public forum, whereas right now it can't go anywhere.
But these hearings are publicly noticed, and the newspaper attending or KTUU attending that other hearing shows that it was out in the public for discourse.
And again, with an effective date that's different, it reaches the public. It's simply, all we're saying is that sitting members can't vote on or propose legislation having to do with their own terms. That's not any different from the way it was done before in 89 or 92, whenever it was. So why, I guess the question is, why do the kind of rewrite the code to accommodate this when it can simply be accommodated within the current writing of the code?
Well, and I understand your point, David, but I also think I would rather have a straightforward way to get things into a public forum before the assembly. I think right now I'm not sure that someone could sponsor they couldn't sponsor anything that had to do with the extension of the terms. They can't get into a public forum at all.
But if it's not, but if it's not an ethical issue, then it doesn't deserve to be in the public forum, right? I mean, if it's something that is so inherently conflicted, then why does it even deserve to be in the public? I guess that's my question. If it's not right, it's not right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, why change the code to allow for an unethical situation to then be brought before the board?
On the hopes that the free market system
Right.
of elections will cure it.
Cure it, right? I mean, if
Well,
it's
yeah,
not right,
why
it's
not
not
let
right.
the assembly say that? Why is the ethics board? Can't the assembly say that?
No, all we're saying is that the code is written properly. And we're agreeing with the code, the way it's drafted, is that there is a conflict. Why create a situation where an unethical situation can then be brought before the board so that they can decide it's unethical? It's unethical, it's as it's written in the code.
But David, obviously the board took great offense at the last at the fact pattern. Okay, but again, what about redistricting, and what about members participating in the review of their own election? I mean, that stuff happens, and shouldn't that be addressed more clearly?
But, but I think Linda's point about external versus internal, elections are external. And they're one of 11 reviewing that their election, and not all members are voted at the same time. And redistricting, yes, that can affect them to a large extent, and I suppose
It absolutely can.
and I suppose that there can be some gerrymandering of some districts that would completely exclude.
Well, it wasn't so much gerrymandering, Keith. It was It was participation in the entire process. I'm not saying there was any evil intent or gerrymandering or anything else, but the people who were involved were in their own districts were the people who were involved in the process, and they definitely had an outcome.
Oh, I'm not saying this that it was. I'm looking at the possibility that it could potentially happen.
Well, it has happened, Keith. That's what I'm saying. It has happened. It does happen. I think this board is very, again, did not like the fact pattern that was presented to them. And continues to think that any code change only has to do with that, versus can you look at this code change and say, yeah, well, maybe it solves some of these other problems, and maybe when you get to someone trying to this other election portion of this legislation coming back, that would still be unethical.
Okay, you had something to say, Linda, and then Ted.
It seems to me that using prior instances of where assembly members voted on something where they may have had interests at stake as examples of something which is ethical relies on a basic assumption that those were ethical. So that's the first hurdle. The second hurdle is, even assuming those were ethical, I still think that there are important distinctions between, for example, redistricting, or for example, and I'm not even sure on the assumption of the assembly member voting on the mayoral election, but that was before my time and I had nothing to do with that. So I'm not even going over that first assumption that was correct. But specifically regarding redistricting, that is also subject to judicial review because of Alaska's status with minority voting. So I don't really see these as comparable. To me, they seem like apples and oranges.
And by the way, I'm not responding because I know there's other people in the queue.
Yeah, go ahead, Ted.
I still can't get it through my mind why they are trying to rewrite this section. If they wanted to enact an ordinance or something to the effect that, any assembly member can introduce any ordinance, that's one thing. But when you're trying to change the whole ethics code here so that they can introduce something, on a one-time deal, I cannot, morally sit still and let that happen.
You can't read Terry's remarks. I like to read the first paragraph of Terry's remarks to you, Dee.
So is this internal deliberations, or is it something we can discuss in open? This letter. I just wanted to raise it as a question because I don't know.
Okay.
Terry submitted a letter to us, and it's comments on the ordinance.
Mm-hmm.
And Dave's raised a question as to whether I can put those, because that will go public. At least the first paragraph will go public. The rest of this doesn't get publicized, right? Lisa's saying no.
I'm not saying that it isn't an issue. I just want to make sure before we start reading into the record that we've discussed whether this is a...
All right, well, I will not read his, but I will paraphrase what he had to say.
Oh, like I say, I'm not saying it's not okay.
Okay.
I just want to make sure that that when he drafted this, I assume I didn't know whether when he drafted this, he expected everybody to be reading this into the public record or not. I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, I have to say I'd rather not hear it.
Yeah.
Okay, well then,
I don't
but
think
what I
that's
will
a good
say,
thing.
what I will say is something that he indicates in his letter, but not necessarily that, in his words.
Well, just propose it as your own idea.
Yes. This is something that hasn't happened, at least in my tenure on this board, where we've been asked to, in a very short period of time, make a change to the ethics code. Normally, these things take months and years. How long did it take us to get the change for just the education, the teachers, the gift?
A year and a half.
Yeah, and we worked on that for a long time, and it's not as though that the board is not willing to, review and make changes, but this, I guess we're not seeing that this is an emergency, and the assembly can override us at any time they want, anyways.
Mm-hmm.
That was the reason I asked you the question about override. If an assembly member does, if the assembly decides to override,
Well, it's not override, Keith. It's whether they decide to amend the code.
no, I'm not talking about.
No, excuse me. They're trying to amend the code so they don't have to override us. And that is wrong. Any way you look at it.
Well, I guess.
Yeah, I think, Ted, as you know, I think the assembly will take care of this in-house anyway.
I guess the question I have is, and I don't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
But the question I have is, what are your thoughts on the timeliness of this, as far as it coming to the board on a Friday afternoon? It was rewritten last week. It came to us on Friday afternoon. We're asked an hour before a meeting before the assembly to, I don't know quite what we're asked to do at this point, have kind of an oral advisory opinion. I don't know what we've been asked to do before this hearing.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you have any comment on the timeliness of how this has unfolded and how the proposed changes have come about in such a relatively rapid manner.
Well, I think the changes of ordinance to that proposed ordinance went back and forth among 3 or 4 attorneys in the Department of Law. And Friday at 5:30, I said, "Wait a minute, I don't think you should be defining the sponsorship as not being an official action." That I got more into a technical argument. And so it actually just because it went back and forth. But you're right, the time limit, the time frame is very is a quick time frame. And of course, there's 2 other similar ordinances, or not similar, but ones addressing election time and dates on today as well, before the assembly subcommittee.
Because we got an email that said that essentially you were assuring us that we didn't need more than an hour to deliberate this. I don't understand that, because
Well, I'm assuming that you wanted to read this thing and get an idea, not that you're going to write an opinion today. I never thought that was something that we could have done.
oh, okay.
But we're expected now to go downstairs in 30 minutes and give our opinion to
Well, but
that
again, maybe
subcommittee.
you don't do that. I don't think that's unfair to say, hey, we need more time to think about this. I don't think that's I didn't see us writing it in a 3-hour period of time. But what I wanted to let you know is that the election part got taken out, that it's purely on ethics, which is, I think, the board's bailiwick. And of course, you're all thinking, well, geez, but the election thing is behind that. And I guess one of the comments that I'm concerned with is that this is unethical. It's unethical under the current code because the current code doesn't have a mechanism. It's sort of like everybody's saying, hey, this is unethical in and of itself. Something more than it's unethical because if it doesn't follow the current code, then yes, it's unethical. And so here's an attempt to change that current code to be able to bring things to the public forum. So it's not just by itself unethical. It's unethical if it doesn't follow the municipal code.
Well, maybe it's the way that it came to us that it appears unethical. Meaning, if this had come to us in the context of there are issues with apparent conflicts with taxes and redistricting. We'd like to change the code to accommodate certain things that the Assembly has essentially been ignoring as not a conflict, but possibly could be a conflict. It came to us in the context of a very unusual and relatively unique situation where the entire Assembly member, or each Assembly member and the entire, as proposed, was conflicted out under the code. So that's a very unique situation. And then it's come to us rewritten, taking that part out under the auspices of, well, there's this redistricting problem. You can understand how it just kind of rubs. It just sounds there's something wrong about the way this has been proposed, and to then take the election part out and then say, oh no, this is really what we're after. That just it just seems, and then an hour before the meeting we're supposed to come up with something. I don't know. This is a very uncomfortable situation for me.
Yeah, I agree.
It seems to have ulterior motives
Yes.
and no plausible deniability of those ulterior motives. If
instead-
if they had been more calculating and Machiavellian, they would have done it in a different
Right.
order, and then we might have been duped.
Right. But I think part of it is this. It appears to be a very dramatic change. Now maybe it's not. Maybe I know
Yeah.
you've worked all week on this, but it seems
I
very
guess I
dramatic.
don't see it as dramatic as you're saying, because it follows the state code and then adds a balancing test. That's the two things it does. I think what everybody's getting caught up in is the original fact pattern, which people found offensive, and obviously still do. And nothing wrong with that. I mean,
Well,
that
I tell you what partly is offensive too, is the what appears to me. I mean, I can read it more carefully, but I'm not offended by anything. There's nothing offensive about it as far as I'm concerned. What I dispute is the characterization of our opinion in the beginning part of this memorandum. I don't agree with this interpretation of our opinion, and so that leads me into this other. So maybe it is just these two small provisions that are being changed, but the whole context of this D is just smacks as not proper. I guess that's part of the problem, and it's not just so. Maybe it's as simple as you say. It's just one provision here, one provision there, but it just doesn't feel that way.
okay.
And I understand maybe more than I'm verbalizing your idea that it's all going to be cured by the Assembly anyway, because I kind of get that there are members of the Assembly that seriously oppose this, and if it goes to a vote, it may just sink. However, what's the point of having an ethics board if the ethics board doesn't voice its opinion when given stuff like this to voice its opinion about?
Well, and unfortunately, that's what it's been asked to do. But I do think that, as David says, the constraints of being provided things at the last minute, and I mean that's a practice of government law because you're doing 80 things, So that's just tactic. Everything's just done at the last second because you have 4 other emergencies ahead of it. So they'd like to get your opinion about it. And when I say they, the Assembly Ethics or Election Ethics Subcommittee. Or if you said you need more time that you would like to opine on it, but you need more time. It is to me also an interesting thing, asking the ethics board their opinion when it's not factual based, because everybody here in that room is going right back to the initial facts. That people aren't distinguishing between this code rewrite and those facts. That's not being done.
Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah. Dee, correct me if I'm wrong. This whole situation, I mean, how long have we had April elections? 20-some years?
Actually, they've gone back and forth a couple times.
Yeah, but
Right.
we've had them. We went from October to April
Yeah.
20-some years ago. Now, all of a sudden, this is such an emergency that we got to get this on there when the citizens of Anchorage have been perfectly satisfied with the April elections. Now, all of a sudden, we've got to make a decision now and make the changes so it can take effect right now. I mean, what's the big hurry?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if they want to come forth and tell us what the big hurry is, maybe we'll understand.
Right.
But there is no hurry. I mean, we've been having April elections for over 20 years. That I'm better than 20 years. Now, why do we have to make a decision in 1 hour to get this changed? I mean, that's
Yeah, and that's a good question.
Yeah.
Why is this being rushed, Dee?
Oh, I'm sure because Chris Birch will come back with the election portion at some point.
I'm sorry, what's that?
I would imagine because Chris Birch will come back with the election portion of it at some point in the near future.
Right.
I mean, what is so gosh down important that he has to stay on the assembly for another 6 months or 9 months?
Again,
What is
you're
it?
getting back to the original fact pattern, not to the code rewrite.
But
You know, the original fact pattern, the entire board thought was under the current ordinance or current ethics code, but could not stand. And so here's a push to, okay, well, what if we changed it? Would this work?
Well, it seems to me that just as a judge might instruct a jury that they are allowed to use their common sense and knowledge of the world and how the world works, that the members of the ethics board should not divorce themselves of their common sense when evaluating matters presented to them.
Yeah.
all right.
I mean, it appears that we don't have anybody that's a strong proponent. You know, in the room here, there's nobody a strong proponent of this change. Dee, I appreciate all the work you've done. Don't misunderstand that.
I don't mean to gang up on you, Dee.
Yeah. Well, and then, you know, I didn't write the whole change. I mean, I
No,
voiced
I
my
know,
opinion. I thought certain things I thought were going to be problematic from a legal standpoint.
Yeah,
So this isn't my ordinance. This is something
No,
I put
You
some
are the
sense into it.
you are the gray and silver phone in front of us instead of you there personally. But so like I said, I really appreciate the work you've done in the short time that you were given to get this done. And I really would prefer to also have remember Terry and Steve here to discuss this as well. But in listening to the room, I don't see anybody here that is a strong proponent of the change, given, you know, in the short nature. Now, in the long term, potentially so, after people have had a chance to sleep on it more than a weekend.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That might be part of the problem too, is that when pushed into this without a chance to really think about it, we can't help but bring in our past experience from last week.
Okay, and I think that's
Does that
fair
make
to
sense?
say that it's hard to separate the two.
It is, and I think that if we were given more time, it's possible we could look at this a little more objectively and deliberate a little bit more on what you're saying, which essentially is just look at this specific code change versus and not try to decide the whole global issue. I think part of it is that we've been pushed into a corner here. It feels like it, into having to do something very quickly, and our gut feeling is to go back to where we were. I think that's natural. And I don't think it's unreasonable for us to do that. If we were to actually go through this, I think it's going to take more time. I mean, that's my opinion. Is because otherwise, what they're going to get is us reacting the same way we did before.
Mm-hmm.
That we're going to need more time to be able to disassociate ourselves from this and treat it like a different matter to be deliberated separately and independently.
And I think that's fair. And I really see that that's what's going on here. Again, that nobody can get past the prior situation to look at a code change. And pretty much that's going to happen at the assembly level too, because everybody does know what's behind it.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, it is the unacknowledged issue, right? I mean, it's like you said.
Yeah.
Of course, what's going to follow this is going to be the elections change. I mean, it's hard, Dee, to separate those two issues when we know one
What
follows
it
the
will do
other.
is get it to a public forum in a debate,
Right.
versus it can't be heard at all.
But they can still bring it forward. All we give is an advisory opinion. They can still bring it forward.
Uh-huh.
And that was the crux of my question to you about to somebody, if they do bring it forward, in contrary to our opinion that we gave them,
Well,
then-
I'm not sure, Keith, anybody would bring it forward unless the ethics code was modified. I mean, I think that people realize that the ethics board has made a pronouncement on this,
but we're an unelected
so I-
advisory board.
right? So I'm not sure how many people want to have a risk of a potential violation.
Well, that was my question to you about, since we gave an opinion, the code allows the assembly to ignore it,
Uh-huh.
and then if somebody goes ahead and still brings it ahead, regardless of who does it, I mean, it could even be Dick Trainee for all we care. But if it is brought up, I don't see where a notice of potential violation would have any standing. They asked us, we gave an opinion, they went ahead anyways, but that's a different situation.
Yeah,
That changes
and
the
I
whole
don't
argument.
know if we get to that point what will happen. I mean, they're trying to do it the other way, get the code modified along the state law lines, and try to eliminate part of the problem.
And if they modify the code before we have chance to fully deliberate and give an opinion on the modification of the ethics code, and then someone brings an alleged violation for that action, then what is the teeth? Where are the teeth?
But, Linda, I think that the Assembly does have a right to modify the code without asking the Ethics Board. They're trying to, Adam with his subcommittee wanted to have input from all sources. That is their bailiwick, changing the ethics code if they want to.
Yeah, I do appreciate the opportunity for input. It's
Yeah,
just that this
so-
is short time.
So, I mean, I do think they have that. And some of the stuff is just pure policy decision more than, at least I see this. So some of it's just policy decision.
I thought you were going to say pure politics.
Yeah. Well,
So,
Well, that too.
so when we go down, he has to leave early. So I'm
Okay.
assuming it's going to be you and I going down. We're going to
Are you
specific.
attending also?
I was going to sit in, and
Yeah, right.
obviously I'm not
Yeah.
really
But-
speaking.
So so we have kind of a unified message. Is it that we feel that we need more time, that we don't have enough time to, in the short time we've had to fully, understand the ramifications of the changes?
yeah.
Is that?
I would appreciate it if you put it that way, that you need more time, because I think there are some pluses to the proposed ordinance, although it's very clear that no one can separate, and not just you, that the public at large is not going to separate it from the election business.
Well,
Part of
Neither
me-
will the Assembly. I'm sorry, I keep interrupting. I'm not following the rules.
Part of me has this sort of morbid curiosity to want it to go forward just to see what the public reaction is and watch all that blows up after that. But I don't think that's really in the interest of good government.
Right, and when I get a call, I'm going to have to say the best I can say is they can listen to the recording. Is that it? Because I will probably get a call this afternoon, as I've had in the last few meetings, from the reporter from the Daily News. And I've been very, very careful,
Well, you have to.
yeah, not to say anything. If he wants to attend the meetings, he can attend it. This is a public meeting, but
Yeah, yeah.
So, Ted, are you comfortable with that stance?
What stands?
Stance is that we don't have the time, we have not been able to take the time necessary to fully consider this
Yeah,
change?
and I say that, in reading this here, the only reason they're doing this because they didn't agree with our decision. Okay, fine, they can do away with it. They don't have to change the law and make it difficult for us in the future just because they didn't agree with what we decided. They can
That's my
bypass, they don't
understanding.
have to listen to what we said.
Ted, nobody disagrees with the ethics board's opinion. You keep saying that, and I don't see that happening at all.
Well, why are they changing it?
Excuse me?
Why do they want to change the ordinance?
Oh no, this board came out very strongly that at the current written code that this was unethical. So now someone tries to say, okay, well, how about if we change this? Then would it be past muster?
Sure.
So
Well,
nobody is ignoring you at this point. They've asked for input. No one. I mean, I just don't see all that.
that's so
happening there.
they're changing it so they don't have to ignore us.
Well, it's like they're changing. Well, yeah.
You know, it just, you know, and they
Oh,
they
and
say,
maybe it is a good thing to say that it's just too tied to the other situation to be able to review it.
Well, I think part of the issue is if it's being pushed this quickly, then it's hard to avoid the assumption that it is tied to that because there is
Yeah,
a timeliness that's associated with that particular proposal. So if it's being pushed in a way that the code changes are not normally pushed, how can it not be tied to that?
Mhm.
It's really hard to disassociate that other issue,
Uh-huh.
especially because that's going to come up immediately after this proposed code change.
Right.
And that's the very first thing that we're going to have to, well, if they choose to come to us, but that's the very first thing we're going to have to decide. Under what? Under a different code. Right?
But would you be deciding that? You wouldn't be deciding that because you don't reweigh the Assembly's factors, right?
Well,
This gets it back to the Assembly to make their own decision.
no, I understand that, but are they going to do it without asking? I mean, like I say, they could do it without even asking an opinion from the ethics
Yeah,
board
just
anymore. They could just
yeah.
go ahead and do it because we can't reweigh it. But
And then we'll see if somebody files a violation
Yeah,
allegation.
I didn't do that one.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was just saying, and then we would just wait and see if somebody files a violation allegation.
Well, but probably there wouldn't be that because the ethics board doesn't have jurisdiction to reweigh the Assembly's
Yeah.
consideration of factors. So that probably wouldn't come back to the ethics
now
board.
that language of reweighing, that's in the original code, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I don't know that I need to talk about this anymore. Right?
Well, Dee, I really appreciate your calling in. I think we've, so what we're gonna go do is go talk to the Assembly, talk to that committee and tell them, you know, we appreciate them asking for input, but we have not had enough time
Fine, yeah.
to consider this and mostly because this is it is just very difficult to make something this short. And, you know, we have a short committee. Yes, we have a quorum, but I really would prefer to listen to the other, you know, the two silent voices that are here or they're not here before we did this. And even if we were able to come up with something in, you know, by the end of February. Go ahead, Ted.
yeah, you know, reading this proposed ordinance over, you know, I mean, we are not inventing the wheel here. The Assembly did this once before.
But that
And
was
it-
under a previous ethics ordinance, so.
No, I mean, if they would do this to take effect after the final board off, there is no conflict, there is no
Right,
nothing.
and that is what we said in our last.
Right. But they want a conflict. So they can change the ordinance to get rid of the conflict. You know, it just, I mean, you know, if it just makes me very, very uncomfortable. I mean, if it walks like a duck and quacks, it probably is a duck.
Yeah, and
And this is wrong. I mean, you read down through these, each one of these here, that state, no matter how great the public purpose, there is no great public purpose in changing the election date. All it is a hope, they hope to get more participation. That's the only thing they brought forward.
But that's a really different issue in front of us, and that's what we're trying to divorce.
But that's,
Yeah.
but that's what they're trying to, why they're trying to do this.
Right.
No,
I mean,
I agree.
So we've got to
Okay.
get downstairs. We would need a motion for adjournment.
move to-
Second.
So moved and seconded.